welcome from the Senior Law Day Collaborative. My name's Melinda Bellus, and I'm the attorney in charge at Legal Services of the Hudson Valley. I'm also a co-chair of the Senior Law Day Collaborative. I share this role with Elena Falcone from the Westchester Library Systems and Sarah Steckler from Keen & Bean. You've joined us today to learn about an update for New York renters on an update for New York renters on law and operations, including evictions. But first, let me tell you a little bit about the collaborative and the resources available to you. The collaborative is composed of more than 150 professionals who are all eager to bring authoritative information on legal, financial, and health topics to our county's older adults. We make available educational workshops throughout the year, as well as brief one-on-one consultations with collaborative professionals. You can connect with our resources and services through our website, seniorlawday.info. The site is a resource for information on legal and financial topics addressed by the collaborative. You can go there to watch the video recordings of prior webinars, access printed reference materials such as our annual and very popular updated elder law Q&A, and you can send us your questions on any topic of concern to older adults. Just look for the Ask Us button on the side. Send us your contact information and a rough outline of your question. We'll work promptly to connect you with the needed expertise. Before we begin, I'd like to give you a few points about the format in which we're working today. This Zoom video conferencing event is being recorded with the aim of posting the recording to the Senior Law Day site. You as participants are muted. You can, however, ask questions via the Q&A box on the bottom of your Zoom window. We may not be able to answer all questions that are posted, but unless you choose to ask anonymously, we will work to follow up on your email. You might also save your question for that Ask Us button that you just saw on the Senior Law Day info website. I'd like to first just give a brief introduction to where we are with evictions right now in Westchester County before turning my presentation over to Marcy Kobach, who's the Director of Litigation at Legal Services of the Hudson Valley. As you may have heard on the news, there's a moratorium on evictions in Westchester County. Nevertheless, some tenant courts are open and accepting filings of new cases. Courts are bringing tenants in on cases which were filed prior to the closing of the courts in March due to COVID, and they're also hearing new cases that have been filed since the courts reopened in July. As Marcy will be discussing, there are administrative orders and executive orders in effect that are controlling this landscape. And pursuant to these orders, cases can only go forward in court where both sides are represented by legal counsel. Settlements can be reached in those cases. So if you have received court papers, either prior to the pandemic or since the pandemic, you can contact Legal Services of the Hudson Valley. Trying to resolve your legal matter now while the moratorium is in effect and before the courts become much more crowded is the best way to address your particular case. Now I will turn this presentation over to today's presenter, Marcy Kobach, Director of Litigation at Legal Services of the Hudson Valley.
Thank you, Melinda, and thank you to the collaborative for the opportunity to provide some clarification and information during what can be a confusing time. Last week, there was very lively news, mostly coming out of New York City, which I think muddied the waters somewhat. And I think it's important that people have accurate information. Now, evictions in New York State, as Melinda indicated, we just like the federal government has the 3 branches, checks and balances. New York State has the same thing. We have the executive, the governor, we have legislative, which is the Assembly and Senate, and we have judicial, which is the New York courts. Of course, an eviction is not legal. It is a crime if a person is evicted or otherwise prevented from safely occupying their home absent a court order. So the courts are absolutely crucial in this process. The highest court in New York State has said, and this order remains in effect, that eviction proceedings are suspended, both the old ones and the new ones. They're suspended. They can't move forward, except that if there are two attorneys, if the tenant has an attorney, the case can be conferenced virtually, and like Melinda said, work towards a settlement. So that's an order from the courts, who have the primary, responsibility in evictions. That's an order that applies statewide. Now, Westchester, the court system is divided into districts, and the district which Westchester is in, along with other neighboring counties, that judge in charge of that district has said, in every time she issues an order saying what the courts are doing, what sorts of new cases they're opening to, that in eviction cases, no default judgments can be entered and no eviction orders can be signed or served. So that means warrants cannot be moving through the court system. And it's very clear, bold language in her order. She also refers to the statewide order. So it's a judge, above her. She's saying, I'm following this and I'm making it abundantly clear what that means. And she also refers to executive orders. Governor Cuomo issued executive order number 202 on March 7th, declaring a state of emergency. Then he has issued 56 more orders, each specifying what we're doing, what the state is doing in this state of emergency with this pandemic. In March, when just hospital beds were filling up at an alarming pace, these orders allowed, medical students to have a little more leeway to be able to treat people. In whatever month it was, when there were some primary elections looming forward, the orders, affected election proceedings, right? These emergency, all these things we need to do in this emergency to prevent further disasters within the emergency. And so one of these steps that was in an executive order was a moratorium on all commencement and all enforcement of any evictions. So, and what will happen with each order is we'll say, okay, all of the other orders, or orders 1 through 8, I'm extending them further. That deadline's going out further. So, for example, one of the executive orders has said that people can have, if they need something notarized, that can be done via video. And that has continued to get extended. And so we have that moratorium, which was extended. There was an order which did change the fact that new court cases could get filed. So that order went into effect and said certain kinds of new cases that aren't for non-payment against somebody who had a COVID-related financial hardship or received unemployment, that those cases can get started. But the court orders and the prior executive order banning the actual eviction remained in effect. Then the legislature comes into play. So the New York State legislature passed a law which allows a tenant to raise the defense of COVID-related financial hardship. And what the law says that if a tenant raises that defense and the court agrees, then the court can order a judgment for money, kind of the same way that, a creditor, like a credit card company, can get a judgment for money. But that judgment for money does not give the court the power to write a warrant, and it does not give, since there's no power to write a warrant, then there's no warrant which a marshal can serve. So an eviction can't occur when that defense is successfully raised. And so because of that, because there's legislation that affects cases being brought and what can happen in certain kinds of cases, the governor said, okay, that piece of the executive order that I did which said which kinds of cases could begin to get filed. We don't need that anymore because we have this legislation. And then it was on August 6th that an order extending prior orders was expiring, and on August 6th that got updated and continues till September 4th. So just as the New York State Bar Association has made clear, and readings of the orders extending other orders make clear, right, that executive order continued eviction moratorium till September 4th. Further, you have the court directives at the statewide and district levels continuing an eviction moratorium, although not a moratorium on the filing of new cases. And then you have legislation which is intended to limit the number of actual evictions, intended to limit the number of people rendered homeless because they lost income due to COVID. And that is the lay of the land. Melinda, was there anything we've discussed recently amongst our housing unit that I missed?
No, I think that was pretty thorough. I mean, that's the lay of the land, and unfortunately we're seeing deviations from what should be happening in different courts, but this is what it is.
Thank you. So I see there's a question about executive orders from Washington. So certainly one thing that's been in the news a great deal is at the federal level, the House and Senate not being able to come to an agreement on a new round of stimulus, on extending unemployment. And so there was news over the weekend that executive orders came from the White House. So of course I reviewed the one which says it addresses evictions, although it does not impose an eviction moratorium. It includes suggestions to HUD and the CDC. The last announcement I saw from HUD was that they did allocate some funds intended to help keep people in their home. It's about $400 million, and it references, that one purpose of it would be to buy more cleaning supplies for federally subsidized housing, things like that, which certainly can help with safety, but do not constitute a federal moratorium. And do we think it will be extended past September 4th? I wish I had any idea.
Yeah, I mean, I would only add that it's been extended, now, but whether we can count on that is we could never predict that, whether we can count on it happening again.
And just about every time the extension has come, not the day of expiration. And I should add a coda that, again, today is August 12th of 2020. This is information which is current through August 12th, 2020. Everything is changing, as just described, quite rapidly and evolving. And of course, legal services is available to people, and we do keep up to date on all these developments.
So should we give a little information about, not to single out courts, but we could maybe talk about, I should get myself on it, maybe just bring up that the most active courts right now that we're seeing filing cases are in Yonkers, Mount Vernon, and New Rochelle. And
right.
And we're, so we're seeing that the hope when tenants come into these courts is to match them up with an attorney, because that's really the only way the cases can move forward. So that's the goal. Default judgments should not be entered if a person does not appear in court. Also, if you have concerns about health and safety, there are exceptions, and you should be contacting the court in advance if you do get court papers. But you know, the court is limited at least through September 4th on what they can do. So people should just know that if they do receive court papers.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so there are in Westchester, actually throughout all of New York, outside of New York City and Long Island, and that including in Westchester, you have two kinds of courts. You have city courts and you have village courts. And the city courts are kind of under an umbrella in the court system. And so when there are there are policies and methods which apply to all of them. And you also, of course, and that relates to facilities, to ventilation systems, and so on and so forth. And so the city courts have been able to do matters virtually because through this centralized system, right, they get the equipment, they set up the email addresses and so forth. So they have been able to open two cases and do as many virtually as possible when there are two attorneys, because then you have two people who in almost every circumstance can access the technology needed to participate virtually and keep everybody out of the courthouse possible unless there's some countervailing concern. But so the city courts have been more active because there's a centralized way for them to get the laptops and have the emails and so forth. The courts in towns and villages, it's kind of tied into the municipality, actually, right? The facility will be a town facility and so forth. And so you don't have that centralized way. So they've been slower. They're kind of creeping towards doing more activity, but it's been slower for practical reasons.
Marcy, we have a few questions, so if I can run them by you. The first one, if my lease runs out in October, do I have to leave?
You cannot be made to leave without a court order. So if the lease runs out, then if a lease is running out and a landlord does not intend to renew the lease, there's a certain amount of notice that must be provided to the tenant, a minimum of 30 days. It could be up to 90 days, depending on the length of time that the tenant has lived there. Then after that notice is properly provided, that is when a landlord can start an eviction case. This is certainly legal information presentation. We certainly wouldn't be giving individual legal advice, but I would be wary of leaving and abandoning an apartment because of a verbal threat from a landlord, because there is a judicial procedure that must be followed.
And that same person asked a follow-up question, if not offered a new lease. So I think you kind of address that by talking about the notice. So if they're not intending, and there's certain types of housing where they really have to renew it unless they violated the lease in some way. So I guess that's another significant thing. The next question, is there any help for the landlord who loses his rental income?
Yeah, there is. And certainly, the people who come to us are renters. We certainly understand that there are, essentially small business owners, right, who are the landlords of our clients. We absolutely appreciate that the hardship caused by this pandemic and the economic ripple effects is really affecting people, on both sides. So there was $100 million, that was another piece of legislation, $100 million to which tenants could apply for it. And this would be based on having lost income, and so their rent burden, the percentage of their income that they must pay, going from bad to worse, going from 30% to 50% or more. And so there was a 2-week application period, which was extended into August 6th to allow more time for the translated versions of the application to have people have access to those and do the application that way if they have limited English proficiency. And so that application period closed on August 6th. And it's a little complicated. The formula is a little complicated, so I don't know that people will be getting decisions on that until at least the end of August, but that money goes directly to landlords, right? The idea is, okay, when the tenant's struggling, there's money available for her landlord. And then there's also a New York Forward loan, which Governor Cuomo announced in the news, I believe last week. So that is a loan that landlords can apply for. Now, there also have been, at the state level, certain mortgage forbearances available, and I'm not equipped to speak to the details of that. There has also been some mortgage relief at the federal level, and there's currently, for people with federally backed mortgages for which there's a forbearance. So there's the forbearance for the landlord, and then that tenant can't be evicted during that forbearance period.
Another question, can you comment on what you were seeing in the White Plains courts?
Very little activity thus far. That could change tomorrow.
And the next question, I think, is similar to the one you just answered. What advice would you give to a landlord who cannot pay taxes and mortgage without rental income? So I think you just provided some information on assistance.
Yeah, I think so. And I think certainly whoever that landlord might go to for advice on a mortgage or on property taxes is, I think, somebody to follow up with, what applicable laws and orders may have been in play during this horrible time.
Two more questions. One, how is the Tenant Protection Act of 2019 related to MCI improvements impacted by COVID?
So what the law referred to was it was we call an omnibus package. It was 2019 law, which affected rent stabilized apartments, and then also affected certain just provisions of the landlord-tenant relationship for any renter in the state and the eviction proceeding process. And so one of the things that did change were for rent stabilized apartments, if there's what's called a major capital improvement, right? A big building-wide improvement that improves the rental experience in a physical way for the tenants to the benefit of all, that's the basis for a rent increase. And so in terms of COVID, I know that deadline, so these MCIs, the landlord would have to request that they be approved and provide documentation to the agency which oversees this, and tenants can challenge them. Now, there was a big chunk of time during which deadlines to, file the response and file the re-response were all on hold. And the last check, those haven't been extended. The only thing further extended were landlords' deadlines to file rent registrations. So I think if somebody's been kind of waiting longer than usual on an MCI, I think that process will start to roll faster.
Have they frozen rent increases for rent-controlled apartments?
There are very few rent-controlled apartments. Sorry, lawyer. There are very few rent-controlled apartments anywhere, really, anymore. The system of rent stabilization is, so rent control is basically World War II era. Rent stabilization is, 1970s. And so very few rent-controlled lots, although fewer and fewer, rent stabilized. And it's county rent guidelines boards which vote on the increases. And I know I've heard news about votes for a 0% increase, and I don't remember off the top of my head if that was a New York City vote or if Westchester County also voted for the 0% increase. So that's something we need to follow up on.
We could also mention about, I guess, SCREE for seniors as a possible way to freeze their rent. And
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. So for somebody who is under a certain income limit and does not have a Section 8 voucher and whose rent stabilized rent increases 30% of his or her income, if that person is a senior citizen or if that person has a disability, a documented disability, in some municipalities, then their rent can be frozen. What happens is they submit an application to DHCR, and then DHCR approves it, and the person, whenever there's an annual increase, that gets paid through a tax credit from the town where the apartment is, as opposed to the tenant paying it out of pocket. That's a complicated way of saying that people who qualify, their rent is frozen.
And how does one best stay on top of developments? They have to look at
right. This is the government, and it is publicly available information. So the governor's website has a page for news and a page for all the executive orders. The legislature, the state assembly, they have a website, and there are different ways to search that. And then nycourts.gov, they have their website as well.
And last question, if there is no lease, what are the regulations for the landlord to give vacate notice?
It depends on the length of time that the tenant has actually lived at the premises. So if it's been more than 2 years, at least 90 days, and if it has been a full year but less than 2 years, 60 days.
And under 1 year, 30 days.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. And that's relative. There's another webinar that Marcy actually did a few months ago that you can find on the Senior Law Day Info website that gives that sort of practical information about recent changes in the law that were advantageous to tenants. And, there was a time, if you had no lease, 30 days for everybody. Now it's 60 or up to 90 days, depending on the length of the tenancy. There's a lot of good information about that housing information in general on this webinar. I think so. Is there anything else that we wanted to add to this? All I can say is it really is changing every day, and stay tuned, as Marcy said. There's literally every day, and often late in the evening or in the middle of the night, and you wake up the next day and something new was issued. But what you can count on is moratorium through September 4th. If you're taken to court, try to get in it, feel free to call legal services, and it's better to do it now. We do expect there's going to be a huge increase, unfortunately, in cases once the moratorium is lifted, and also because of the ends of the $600 a week that was going for unemployment. We know that a lot of people were keeping their housing because of that extra $600 a week, and we hope they'll come up with something the same or at least close to the 600 going forward, but so far that hasn't happened. So we've already got a few weeks where people are going to be falling behind. So we're looking out for that too. So thank you, Marcy, very much for sharing all of that information. And for anyone who missed part of this or wants to see it again, there should be a copy of this presentation on the Senior Law Day Info website in a few days. Now I'm just going to turn it over to my colleague, Bruce Siegel.
People can see my screen. Trying to share my screen. Sorry, let me try again. Oh, here. hopefully you can see, I'm just trying to pull up the screen with the sponsors for this program. And I just wanted to take a moment to all of our corporations, firms, and organizations and individual small businesses who have continued to sponsor us and make these programs possible during what is a very challenging year. And we appreciate everyone's support very, very much. And you can just see, how much interest there is in these topics, from today and all the questions that we received. So with that, I think we're at the end of our webinar, and there is one other question that we'll respond to privately. And if you have other questions, just hit the Ask Us button. And we wish you a great day. Next week, we have, at this time, August 19th at 10 o'clock, a great program for anyone involved who's a grandparent involved in raising or kinship arrangements with their grandchildren. I know there are a lot of concerns now with school opening and health concerns. So feel free to check out the website and sign up for that free webinar. And with that, I want to thank the presenters again and wish you a great day.